I'm glad to be here. I want to thank my hosts for a very warm welcome. I want to thank Sylvia for doing an excellent job beforehand. To underscore one thing that Sylvia said, which I think is important, and that is writing is hard work. It takes a long time. If I work all day on a new manuscript, I consider it a successful day if I get 2 pages written. Which means if I'm writing a 30-page manuscript, the first draft will be done if I have worked for 3 weeks full time. And then the revisions start. So a good paper takes a very long time and a lot of hard work. It's not going to come quickly and it's not going to come easily. I don't say that to discourage you. I say that because lots of people aren't going to put the time in, and if you do, it will show. All right. Well, I guess I'm filling in time for when my slides show up. Are we almost there? Perhaps. Yes. Please stand by. We're having technical difficulties. The virtual audience will have the slides,
but
not the actual audience.
So
Could be a problem since I won't know what I'm talking about.
it's like virus or something. You need a
Well,
printed version of your talk, or
you just need to be able to see the slide that is on the screen. It's okay. Wait, things are happening.
In the meanwhile, you could have seen the publishing sound. Precisa reiniciar aí, você ir acompanhando. Ok. Você pode transmitir e passar os slides daí, por favor. Okay, Brett,
We are ready.
we're ready.
Thanks for your patience. We will begin. Title of my talk is Revise and Resubmit, a long journey. And it is a long journey. I already indicated how long it takes to start to get a paper where you hope it will be in to submit. And that was Sylvia's job. And my job then is to describe what happens to that paper once you hit submit. So we'll begin. Let's begin by reminding you what the purpose is of peer review. You want to send your paper to a peer-reviewed journal because it's a peer-reviewed journal that's going to get your paper read and that's going to ensure that the quality of your publication is high. So why do we have peer review? Peer review serves several purposes. The first is to advise the editor about whether this paper is worth publishing. So the reviewers, experts in the field, are writing the review primarily to assist the editor in making a decision. And then the editor is going to be writing to you about some suggestions, if you get this lucky, some suggestions for how you can improve your paper that the reviewers are making. So the reviewers their first and foremost job is to talk to the editor. They're communicating to the editor about the quality of the journal, about the quality of the paper, about how to improve the paper, and suggestions for how to move the paper forward. A secondary aim of the reviewer in the peer review process is to communicate with the author. So the reviewer is writing to the editor, suggesting to the editor that you might indicate to the author that this paper could be improved if you do these things. The reviewer's job is to evaluate the validity of the methods. So the reviewer is going to write again to the editor, indicating that the procedure was sound and that the scientific process seems to be valid. The reviewer is going to describe the significance of the findings. Was this something worth taking up pages in the journal? Are these findings important? Are they going to move the field ahead? And the reviewer is going to communicate to the editor whether or not this is original research. Is this something that no one has ever done before, or is this a repeat of some slight variation on the same story? All of these things, the reviewer's job is to convey to the editor, and the editor will then make some decisions on the basis of these comments and pass them along to you, dear author. So, peer review. When you're an author, you often think that this is the sole purpose of peer review, to tell you that your work is bad. Although it's tempting to make the conclusion that the reviewers are recruited for the sole purpose of taking down your paper, good reviewers don't view that as their job. And a good editor will not view a reviewer as doing his or her job if their only goal is to tell you that the paper is terrible. What I look for in a good reviewer is a good reviewer to tell me what the paper does, that's good, that's new, that's original, that's interesting, is it sound, is it valid, and what can be done to make it better. I don't want reviews that tell me about all the horrible, terrible things that are involved in this particular manuscript, because that doesn't then help me to make a decision on whether to publish it, and if I do want to publish it, how I can make it better. So you've submitted your paper, you wait anxiously a few weeks, hopefully, and not a few months, to hear back from the editor. And when you do, you're likely to get one of 4 types of letters. You're going to get a reject without review, a reject, a revise and resubmit, or accept. Now, let me underscore something that Professor Kohler said earlier. If you submit an article to a journal and the first thing that happens is that it is accepted, then you need to publish in another journal, because no good respecting journal is going to take your paper on the first submission. And if they do take your paper on the first submission, tells me they're pretty desperate, because even the very best scholars in the field do not have their papers accepted on a first submission. Don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged. Everyone gets rejected, and I do mean everyone. I would guess that for every paper I have published, that paper has been rejected on average 3 times, 4 times. I mean, when Sylvia says we have a collection of rejection letters, we have a collection of hundreds of rejection letters. I can count on one hand the number of papers that have been more or less, not fully accepted, but more or less happy to be accepted on the first submission. It's a very unusual occurrence. So when you pick up a journal, even the best journal, chances are very good that most of the papers that you read in it have been rejected somewhere else, and they end up being published here as a second choice. You're thinking, how can that be? I read child development, and I'm telling you that those papers were first submitted to Psychological Science, or they were submitted to Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, or they were submitted to Lancet. All of these papers, for the most part, have seen reviews somewhere else. So the point I want to make is that this is not about you. Don't take this personally. If you take this personally, you're in the wrong business. All of this rejection is the life of the scientist. You spend all of your time trying to figure out how to get in the heads of the reviewers and the editor, because you know that they're going to reject you, and you trying to anticipate what it is that they're not going to like. It's not about you. They don't know you, and even if they do know you, it's not going to be helpful because they are focused on your work. So don't take this personally. Here's a little cartoon to remind you not to take it personally. We want to think that the reviewers are attacking us, but the reviewers are not attacking us. The reviewers are focused on the work. They have much better things to do than to worry about you. I know all about being rejected, so I'm going to describe the tale of our paper that we recently published. And this paper that we recently published was submitted to this many journals. I don't know, 11, 12, before it finally found a home in a good journal that liked it. This is extreme, but I picked this example for you in order to communicate to you that everyone has difficulties getting published. No one finds this to be an easy task, and you should not give up, because there will be a home. If you've done good science, there will be a home for your paper. So these are all the journals. We had this nice little paper on girls and dating and diabetes, and this is the order in which they were submitted. And you can see, if you read carefully, that the decision letters came in from a no review, we got a review, we got a preliminary review, we got no review, we got reviewed, we got no review, we got no review, we got no review, we got no review, we got reviewed, we got no review, we got no review, we got no review, we got reviewed, we got no review, and finally, eventually, we'll talk about what happens when we get to closer to the point of happiness. So one option that many journals increasingly rely upon is a reject without review. Reject without review occurs when the editor or a small number of associate editors will do what we call pre-screen the paper. Pre-screening the manuscript involves looking at the manuscript to see, is this a paper that has any chance of being published in this journal? If not, then it's not going to be sent out for a regular round of reviews. This saves enormous amounts of work on the part of the journal and the editor, and it saves enormous amount of time on the part of the author. If you think of a journal that gets 500 submissions, if you think that each manuscript should get 2 or 3 reviews, that means you're looking for 1,000 or 1,500 reviews, and if you think that for every review that you get, 3 reviewers are going to turn you down, that means that you're looking at recruiting almost 5,000 reviews over the course of a year. That's a lot of time and effort. If a paper does not have a good chance of being published in the journal, many journals will resort to a pre-review process in which essentially within a week or 2, a couple of members of the editorial team will review it, and they will decide to send it back to the author without soliciting external reviews. Reasons why this may happen. First and foremost is that it is a poor fit for the journal. A lot of times editors will look at a manuscript and say, this does not fit our scope. You can save yourself a lot of trouble by carefully reading the website for the journal and finding out what their focus is. If their focus does not match your paper, don't send it to them. You're wasting your time and their effort. So poor fit is one of the primary reasons why manuscripts get returned without review. Poor science. This goes without saying. If a manuscript is so bad that the editor and an associate editor look at it and say, this has no hope of ever being published here because the science is so weak, then they're going to turn it around and send it back. There is a good reason for doing this, because if the science is so poor, no amount of reviewing is going to make it publishable. Poor writing. Sylvia has touched upon this. I will not belabor it. If the writing is impenetrable, even if it's great science, no one will read it. And if no one will read it, no one will cite it, and that's bad for the journal. We want people to read the articles in the journal. We want them to cite the articles in the journal, and if they cannot be read, they will not be cited. Manuscripts are returned sometimes, less frequently, for a lack of originality or a lack of novelty. Some journals particularly focus on trying to make new contributions or say interesting things to broad audiences, particularly if you're looking at a journal that has a wide scope, that they're trying to communicate with lots of different kinds of scientists. They are looking for articles that are a little bit catchy, that are a little bit novel. And so if you're looking at a broad range, wide-reaching journal, they're going to be more interested in the novelty factor, in can this be sold to the local newspaper, than more specialty journals are. You will get rejected without review if the editor concludes that your manuscript lacks significance. And by lacking significance, that means that the editor has concluded that it's not important. How can you determine if your findings are important? You can call up your mama and you can tell her, this is what I found. And if she says, I already knew that, or if she says, I have no idea what you're talking about, then chances are good your paper doesn't have any significance. You should be able to explain your findings to the lay community in ways that will make them say, that's interesting. That was a good use of the last 2 years of your time. I'm glad my taxpayer dollars funded that. Sometimes, and I don't endorse this, but some journals will give you a reject without review and give you almost no feedback whatsoever. They'll just send it back. Let's see some examples. So remember, we're taking you on a long odyssey through this poor paper, and I'm going to give you some examples of some letters that you're going to see from editors. This is an example of a reject without review where we were told that it was a poor fit. Now, why am I walking you through all of these? Because you're going to learn, after a couple of rejections, what needs to be done with this paper, where I should be submitting it. You're going to get better at matching your paper to your journal. It's a tricky job at first. It requires some thinking, some clear thinking and some clear knowledge of what journal you want to send it to. So we sent this paper to the Journal of Applied Developmental Psychology, and they said to us, quite reasonably, your paper is about diabetes. That's a very narrow topic. It doesn't really have applied developmental psychology focus. And if I look over the past year, I don't see any papers that we published on that topic. Now, of course, if I had done my homework, I could have figured that out. And so we got a letter saying this manuscript does not fit the scope of our journal. We got a letter saying that we didn't do our science very well. In this particular paper, the editor suggested that there were some things that we had not taken into account as we designed our study and conducted our study. In other words, in this case, there were some variables that we weren't looking at that we should have looked at that could have accounted for our findings. You're less likely to get this kind of feedback from the editor unless, and this is important, unless your manuscript has a truly fatal flaw in it. And if you get feedback from a couple of journals saying there's some kind of fatal flaw with your manuscript, stop sending it out. If editors start to see this as an obvious problem, then take the paper back and revisit it. Sometimes you're going to get a lax novelty reject without review. In this case, the journal editor suggested that this is really not something that our readers are going to find very interesting. Perhaps you should send it somewhere where the readers are going to be more familiar with the topic and they may think that this is something worth spending their time reading. Here's a long blah 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 letter, very polite, very nice, but basically they said, so what? And this is a problem that you need to pay particular attention to. Young scholars have a very difficult time making their papers communicating their findings in a way that make them sound important. And your abstract is key in this regard. If the editor reads your abstract and is not very interested in reading anymore, then the chances are good that he or she may not read anymore, and you may get rejected without review. If your abstract does not convey the importance of your work succinctly, then one of two things is possible. It is not important, or you have done a poor job communicating why it is important. If you cannot communicate why it is important in the abstract, the chances are very good that you will not be able to communicate it in a longer form. And then you may very well get a reject without review that gives you a list of all of the reasons why you might be rejected, and you won't know what to do with that. This is least helpful, and you can't really move your paper forward for this particular reason. So you've been rejected without review. What are you going to do next? The first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at that letter that you got from the editor, and you're going to read it carefully. You're going to read it carefully for cues and clues as to why you were rejected. And you're going to take a look at them and then make an assessment of what to do next. Was it poor fit? Well, that's something you can fix. Is there a fatal flaw that you neglected or hoped they would overlook? That's something you can't fix, and you better start again. Is it poor writing? Is it lack of novelty? Figure out what the editor is telling you before you move ahead to the next step. Determine if you can make the changes that the editor has suggested, and if you can, identify a new journal doing a better job, picking the fit, and then submit again. Now let's say that you get past the editor and you go out for review. Chances are very good. I should say in many journals, about a third of the papers that are submitted will get a reject without review. So don't take this personally. Reject without review is a very common outcome. Rejection is a very common outcome as well. So if you get your manuscript past the editor and it goes out for review, it's still likely to be rejected. Manuscripts, many journals have manuscript acceptance rates 20, 15, 10%. So if you're sending it to a journal that has a 20% acceptance rate, let's say 30% of the manuscripts get rejected without review, that means that still 50% of the submissions are going to go out for review and be rejected. This is going to be a common outcome. Why are you going to be rejected? Well, fatal flaw, we just talked about that. Poor science. This is where the reviewers have looked very carefully at the manuscript, much more careful than the editor did on the first screening, and identified problems with the procedure, problems with the way you conducted your study. You're going to get rejected for a poor sample. The reviewers find that there is something unrepresentative about your sample, or that your sample was too small. You're going to get rejected for poor writing. You're going to get rejected for poor framing. By poor framing, we mean that the hypotheses for the study are not clear, or that the study does not address the hypotheses that you said it would address. So you need very clear hypotheses for the study. The hypotheses need to match the introduction, and then the science needs to match the hypotheses. If you have not framed your study correctly, it means there is some kind of mismatch between the hypotheses and your results, or the hypotheses and the introduction. Then we have the problems we discussed earlier: lacks novelty, lacks significance. So here's a long letter. This was a rejection letter, and we're going to go through several of the points that were raised by this particular reviewer. The first point: the focus on non-dating adolescence relegates the paper to a narrow and perhaps insubstantial contribution to the literature. Ouch. This is amplified by the small sample size. So we're going to look at that comment, and we're going to take a step back. We're going to go back to the list of reasons for rejection, and we're going to label each of the reasons given to us so that we can better understand what the reviewers are talking about. So when the reviewer says that there's an insubstantial contribution to the literature, he or she is telling us, rather bluntly, that our paper lacks significance. And then when the reviewer says that your sample is too small, the reviewer doesn't like the sample either. Next paragraph: being involved in a romantic relationship during adolescence can best be conceived of as a state, but your measurement plan appears to treat it as a trait. Several reviewers expressed concern about this conceptualization. I could go on. But here what the editor is telling me is that what you are testing does not seem to match the way that you have framed the study. The hypotheses that you have set up do not match the introduction that you have laid out. You have this state idea, and then you talk about traits, and it doesn't seem to map onto your hypotheses. So your hypotheses are key. This is what you're saying that you're doing in the study. And if your introduction doesn't match your hypotheses, or if your hypotheses don't match what you're doing, then there's a mismatch. And that's what the editor is telling us here, that we haven't framed our hypotheses in ways that the introduction makes sense, and in ways that we can interpret the results. Then we have a very long paragraph here. Mediation analyses require the demonstration of an association between two variables, and the demonstration that a third variable mediates the association. In the case of this particular study, there was no relationship, thus referring to the analyses as mediation is confusing. You can't really call this mediation. Now, we're not going to, at this point, address the merits of the comments. All we're doing is labeling them in terms of understanding whether or not, whether we understand why the reviewer doesn't like the paper. Later, we're going to go and see whether this makes sense and whether we can do anything about it. We're not trying to agree or disagree with the reviewer now. We're trying to label the reasons for the rejection. And in this case, the reviewer is saying, your analyses are not correct. You're saying you're doing mediation, but you're not really doing mediation. Again, we're not going to quibble with the reviewer at this stage. We're trying to understand what they're telling us. Next paragraph. Adolescents were not randomized to dating and non-dating conditions. Well, anytime anybody says that your sample is not randomized, or that the people that are put into conditions are not representative, or one thing or another that has to do with lack of randomization, then they are telling you that your science is not good. They could also be saying that your sample is poor. Finally, along with several reviewers, I struggled with the logic behind, okay, so I don't even need to read anymore. If they're struggling with my logic, it's either poor writing or it's poor framing. We don't need to go into the reasons right now. If they can't understand the reason why, then either I've done a poor job writing it, or I've done a poor job explaining the framing and the hypothesis of the paper. So you're going to go through and you're going to have pages and pages of reviews. Let's say every reviewer writes a page and a half. You get 3 reviewers, you're going to have 4.5 pages plus another page from the editor. You've got 5.5 pages. Lots and lots and lots of information to unpack. You're going to go through those letters and those comments, and each different one you're going to put a tag on so that you can understand where the problems are. And the problems are likely to pile up in one area or another. If the reviewers are doing a great job, you're going to get them to say more or less the same thing. Maybe not in exactly the same ways. That's why this exercise is helpful. You're going to get poor framing, poor framing, poor framing, written in lots of different ways, but they're all going to say the same thing. And then you're going to be able to see, without worrying about the details, oh, I've done something wrong in terms of matching the introduction to the hypotheses to the research. So at this stage, you're not focused on the teeny tiny little comments. You're focused on understanding the big reasons for what's being raised. And if the editor and one reviewer or 2 reviewers says these things are a problem, and you get replicability and reliability, then you should take this very seriously. And if all of the comments from all of the reviewers, even if the details are different, if all of the comments focus on the same area, writing, sample, hypotheses, then once again you should take these comments as serious indications that this is where your efforts need to be focused. Okay, so you got rejected. And you went through this exercise of labeling each comment, so you have some ideas about where the problems are. What's next? Next, you're going to evaluate the content of the letter. Now we're talking about moving to a different level than just labeling the reasons. We labeled the reasons so we can see where they're starting to pile up and whether there's some consistency there. Now we're going to look at the comments specifically. Reviewers are not perfect. And sometimes they're going to say some crazy stuff. And it can be hard when you're new to this game to know which are crazy comments and which are stuff you should take seriously. And this is where working with somebody who's seen a lot of rejection letters can be helpful, because sometimes it can be difficult to know whether this is something that you should take seriously or this is something that you should not take seriously. Of course, if your paper gets rejected twice, or if 2 reviewers say exactly the same thing, then you take it seriously. But one comment from one reviewer about one thing, you should give it serious consideration, and you should have some discussions with people with whom you trust about the degree to which changes in the paper are necessary. I have seen junior scholars take a whole introduction and throw it away and rewrite it again simply because some reviewer made some passing comment about something or another, and this is too much. Look to see if there's some consensus building among the reviewers, and look to see if other people agree that that's a content, that comment makes enough sense that it warrants all the effort it will take. So you're going to determine if the changes can be made, if they should be made. You're going to revise your manuscript, and you're going to submit it to a new journal. Here's a very important point. You got rejected. People provided you with reviews. The editor identified those people as being expert in the area, and so they were the best qualified people to write a review on a topic. If you make no changes to your paper on the basis of the reviews, you're going to send it to the next journal, and the editor is going to identify the best people to review your paper. Who do you think is going to get it the next time around? The same reviewers are going to get it, and they're going to look to see if you did anything they said the first time around. And if you didn't do anything they suggested the first time around, they're going to be annoyed. And an annoyed reviewer is not a happy reviewer. It's not a friendly reviewer. You do not want to have a review that says, I reviewed this paper before and they didn't bother to make any of the changes that I suggested the first time. So don't just treat the previous rejection as something to be ignored and thrown away. Remember that these same reviewers are going to look at it again. And so to the extent possible, you're going to make as many of the changes that make sense, that are reasonable, that improve the paper, that you can, knowing that the same reviewer is very likely to see the paper again. So you're going to make some changes, and then you're going to find the right journal and submit it again. And after 10 or 11 tries in this case, hopefully 1 or 2 in your case, you're going to get a letter that invites you to revise the manuscript and send it back. This is a happy day. This is the day when the editor says, we're willing to look at another go around. So let's take a look at a letter that has a revise and resubmit. Thanks for submitting it. I've received the reviews. Based on my review, I'm not able to accept your submission. So let's stop there for a minute. I have had students come to me and said, this is a terrible day, my paper has been rejected, what are we going to do now? And you tell them, your paper, everybody's paper is rejected. No one is accepted on the first time. This is the language of, yes, your paper is rejected, but we're willing to look at it again. This is good news, not bad news. Whenever you get a manuscript review that says, we'll take another look, that's always good news. Somebody liked it. They're not allowed to tell you that, because then you're going to get too excited. Then you're going to think it's going to actually be published, which is no guarantee that it's going to be published. But they're willing to take a look at it again. So they're going to reject it, and they're going to allow you to submit it again. The reviewers provided excellent comments, and then the editor will go on to say, and here are a few of my own. And in the cover letter, the editor is going to highlight some ideas that the editor thinks needs to be addressed, and some of the main points that the reviewers think need to be addressed. So now what do? The first thing that you remember is that the editor is an emperor. And I don't mean the editor of the whole journal, I mean that particular editor handling your manuscript. He or she runs the show. He or she is making the decision. He or she is calling the shots. Whatever the editor writes in the cover letter to you, saying you need to make these changes, you need to make these changes. Don't quibble with the editor. Don't tell the editor all the things that they don't understand. Don't say you're not going to make all these changes. The editor is putting material in the cover letter that he or she thinks is key, is critical to getting the manuscript published. The editor has 5 or 6 pages of comments from reviewers. He or she is going to look at those and say, these are the important things that you must attend to. So it is key that you do what the editor asks. This is not the place to demonstrate your superior intellect. This is the place to be as compliant as possible. So the editor is going to say, the reviewers have expressed several concerns. This requires a substantial revision. Many of these concerns, and this is where you pay attention, many of these concerns pertain to, and then they're going to explain what the main point is. So in this case, many of these concerns are about the conceptualization of your paper. So the editor is saying, looky here, you have some issues with conceptualization. Attend to what the editor says. This may involve, in the case of this letter, looking at previous literature, providing better support, maybe relabeling this construct. So the editor has said very clearly, I want you to attend to this particular aspect of the paper, and I want you to pay particular attention to these parts of the review. The cover letter is key to getting your paper accepted. You have to do what the editor says as much as possible. And the editor is essentially writing to you a letter saying, this is the most important stuff. Yeah, pay attention to all the rest of it. But this part here is key. And if the editor is doing his or her job, he is treating the reviewers as advisory, not counting votes from the reviewers. And so the editor is taking the information in and saying, this is what's important. When I'm making the decision, as the editor who has the final say, this is what I'm going to make the decision on. It is not a good editor who makes decisions based on stuff that's not written in his or her cover letter. The cover letter is the editor's way of communicating to you that this is what I'm going to be looking for primarily in a revision. Whether you were rejected or invited to revise and resubmit, you are going to take the stance that the reviewers are your enemy. And that somehow you have to overcome the reviewers or confuse them enough to get your way. And this, my friends, is the wrong strategy to take. When you get those reviews back, you're going to be furious, you're going to be outraged, you're going to have all kinds of nasty things to say about the reviews. And so you're going to put that review away for a few days, and then you're going to come back to it and read it in a calmer light. And when you read it in that calmer light, you're going to take a new position. And that new position is that the reviewer is my friend. The reviewer is your friend. This is a person who has dedicated 3-4 hours out of their busy life to read your manuscript and comment upon it. No one is going to read your work more carefully than these reviewers. When you pull a manuscript off the shelf or download it online, do you spend 4 or 5 hours reading it and picking it apart? No, you do not. The only people who are spending that kind of time with your manuscript are the reviewers. They are doing you a favor, and you need to treat them as you would anyone doing you a favor, with gratitude and deference. That doesn't mean that they're always correct, but it means that they deserve the respect from someone, from you, because you know that this is something that they don't have to do for you. Nobody has to be a reviewer, and nobody has to read your paper. So the reviewer is doing you a favor, and you're going to treat them as if it's, as Sylvia said, a friend who is doing this favor for you. You're going to write respectfully to them, and you're going to take what they have to say under serious consideration. Of course, not everything they say is correct, but most of what they say is correct, because if the editor has done his or her job, then he or she has gotten a reviewer who knows a lot about the topic, and that reviewer is trying to communicate to you how your manuscript can be better, how your manuscript can be improved. A good reviewer, remember, is not designed to take you out or to cut you down, but to make your paper better, to advise the editor how this manuscript can be improved. So the editor is looking to the reviewer for advice, and the reviewer is advising the editor on ways to make the paper better, and all of this is supposed to be a collaborative process. They're trying to help the paper. So the reviewer is usually right. They usually know better, not always. Sometimes they're going to say crazy stuff, and that's okay. Your friends say crazy stuff too. You say thanks I'm going to figure out a way to make you feel good about that, but I'm going to ignore that. Oftentimes, the reviewer says things that are not correct, but you're going to take responsibility for it anyway. So if the reviewer says, you didn't do X, instead of writing, of course I did X, you stupid reviewer, it's right there on page 9, you're going to say, I must not have done a very good job communicating this particular construct, and so I've added a sentence making it clearer. That's the nice thing to say, and why not? If the reviewer missed it, perhaps you didn't make it very clear. Perhaps it does need to be made more obvious. What's the harm in adding another sentence, highlighting the construct that the reviewer did not see? There are so many ways that you can approach the reviewer with a deferential, respectful way, because the reviewer is trying to do you a favor, and you can say, well, maybe I could have done a better job there, even if it was in the manuscript, even if it should be clear. There's always room for improvement. You quarrel with the reviewer at your own risk. So when you take the reviewer on and say, you're wrong, I'm right, here's all the stuff that makes me right and you wrong, then you put the editor in the awkward position of having to pick between you and the reviewer. And unless you're really famous, chances are the editor is more interested in the reviewer than in you, because the editor needs that reviewer to write another review another day. And the editor does not necessarily need you to send another paper in that was going to be rejected. So if you set the editor up for making a decision between you and the reviewer, you are putting the editor in a very difficult spot. You want to make this easy for the reviewer to agree and easy for the editor to agree, and you want to say we're all on the same team here. We're all working to the same goal. Don't pick a fight with your reviewers. It's bad strategy, and it's almost never succeeds. It is not a recipe for getting your paper published. All right, lots of words here. This is an example of a sample review. We don't need to go through all of this in any great detail, but a good review will do the following. It will start off with, here's a summary of the paper. Why do good reviewers do that? Good reviewers do that to prove to you and to the editor that they read it and that they know what the most important part of the paper is. And if the reviewer writes this summary, and the summary doesn't really match with what you think is the most important part of the paper, it doesn't really match with what you think that you did, again, it's probably not the reviewer's fault. So the good reviewer is writing to the editor to say, I read this and this is what it seems to be about. And then a typical review will then march through the sections of the paper with comments on each. Comment on the title, comment on the abstract, comment on the introduction. I'm not going to review these in any particular detail now. Instead, we're going to talk about how you are going to respond to this reviewer. This comes from the letter from the editor. The editor writes to me and says, if you decide to revise your paper, please submit a list of specific changes for each reviewer comment, citing the page and the paragraph in your revision. What does that mean? That means that your letter, your response back is going to be pages and pages long. You're going to cut out the comment that the reviewer made. You're going to paste it into your letter. And then underneath it, you're going to write, this is my response. On page 9, I made this change. The reviewer was right. This was confusing, so I recast this. Then you're going to go to the next comment the reviewer made. You're going to cut it out. You're going to paste it in, and then you're going to respond to that particular comment with the page number, with the paragraph, with exactly what you did to address the reviewer's comments. Some authors think that it's very important to thank the reviewer for every single comment that they made. I personally find this rather tedious. If there are 50 comments made by different reviewers, Each one does not need to be thanked. This was a brilliant comment by the reviewer. Thank you so much for raising it. I think this makes for a long and boring response letter. In your cover letter, tell the reviewers that you really appreciate what they did and let it go at that. You don't have to write thank you for every single comment that they raised. If they did something that was particularly insightful, then you can make a note of that and say, wow, I never thought of that, and this was really a cool idea. But, you know, the reviewer is not going to be fooled if you omitted a citation and you say, thank you so much for pointing this out, my life will never be the same again. It cheapens the comments that you make later on when they really are meaningful. If it is not possible for you to address the changes that the reviewer requests, then you need to say so. You need to say it as clearly as possible. I think this is a great idea. I just can't do it. We don't have more subjects. We can't run those analyses because we don't have the power for it. This is an acknowledgement of the problems that you have with your paper. And so the next thing that you write is, we didn't have enough power to run those analyses, and so in the discussion we have listed this as one of the limitations. We didn't have enough power to run these analyses. You want to limit this as much as possible because it's acknowledging that your paper has some weaknesses. What you don't want to do is say, well, the reviewer is right, we could have done this, but we decided not to do it because fill in the blank. This is not going to make people happy. Sample cover letter. Thank you for the opportunity to revise and resubmit our manuscript. We followed all the guidelines. We're so grateful to the reviewers. In this revision, we incorporated as many of these comments as possible. And again, we thank you for your attention. And then you have your response letter. Again, lots of small print. We don't have to go through each one. What you're going to see here is, there's the comment on the title. The reviewer said, you should do X to the title. And we wrote, done, we did it. We did exactly what you asked. The reviewer says, in the abstract, the mean and standard deviation should be given. And we say the descriptive information was added to the abstract on page 2 and to the participants section on page 6. We say what we did, we say where we did it. Next, the authors should use accepted terms. Okay, that's a great suggestion. We're going to change our terminology, and we did it all throughout the manuscript. We changed this term to that term. The reviewer says, you should reorganize your introduction to X, Y, and Z. This makes you crazy. You have to rewrite your whole introduction because the reviewer thought so. You could say, no, I'm not going to do that, Mr. Reviewer, and annoy the reviewer. Or you can spend the time it takes to make your introduction clearer, if the reviewer's comments make sense. So we rewrote the whole introduction, just exactly as the reviewer said, and it read better. And we said as much. We reorganized it. We start off with what you did, and it follows exactly what you said we should do. If you must agree because the reviewer is wrong, then you have to put it diplomatically. The reviewer said you can't run mediation analyses, and in fact, we could run the mediation analyses. So we very politely said, well, these guys here who are expert on mediation analyses said that under these circumstances, the mediation analyses might be cast in this way, and so we're doing it according to the strategy that's been well accepted by the experts in the field. So you don't say the reviewer is wrong, you say, we looked up some sources and we're following this procedure. And if you have to disagree because you cannot comply, again, we have a lot of blah, blah, blah here. But the bottom line here on the slide is, we don't disagree with what you said. It was an excellent comment, but we can't run the analyses because we don't have enough subjects. And so we just said that now in the discussion. We said it would be great if we could have run these analyses, but we couldn't do it. Period. You send your revision back with your careful cover letter. It comes back from the editor, and hopefully it says, 2 of the original reviewers really liked your paper. There are only a few small comments that have to be addressed. At this stage, you should be home free. At this stage, you should be doing exactly what the editor says you should do, because by and large, most of the comments are going to be small and they're going to be manageable. The second revision should be the revision where you really are able to do exactly what the editor says, because these tend to be fairly narrow, fairly small changes. I want to underscore by conclusion something that Sylvia pointed out. The point of publishing is not to publish. It may seem that the point of publishing is to publish when you're starting off in your career. The point of publishing is to have people read your article and to cite your article. You don't want to become my age and find out that you have 50 papers and no one has ever cited 20 of them. That's a bad sign. Far better to make sure that you have a smaller number of papers that have something to say. Make sure that your work has something to say. The point of publishing is not to publish. The point of publishing is to make a contribution. And how do we measure a contribution? We measure it because it is making change. It's either making change in the field, that means people are citing it, or it's making change in an applied sense, which means that people out there in the real world are implementing programs, changing policies on the basis of what you write. Mind your marketing? This is my marketing.